1,000 feet below, staring death right in the teeth. She didn't really feel fear, just an odd weightlessness and great annoyance. Sherry and Tara held her by a belt and were slowly pulling her back into the trail. "Please don't do that again," Tara said. "What is wrong with you anyway, short stuff?" Sherry said. "Weren't your stubby legs, little legs, able to stay on the trail?" "I guess not," JT said. "Are you alright?" Sam asked. "Yeah, I'll be fine." "Okay then, let's keep moving. It's another 12 miles to Lookout Point." "Why do we do this every year?" Chelsea whined. "Because it's fun," Cassandra answered, receiving a hostile stare from Chelsea. "Fun," Chelsea said. "Climbing a dangerous trail 20 miles to camp out, then go back down the next day is fun." Cassandra laughed. "It's not that dangerous." "Why don't we ask JD if she thinks this trail is dangerous?" Okay, Cassandra conceded, "but it is still fun. Last weekend of the summer, all of us together for camp out at Lookout Point. What could be better than that?" Chelsea thought for a moment. Aside from the threat of imminent death, it would be fun if it really was all of us. Cassandra ignored the dig. "Yeah, I was disappointed George did not come too. He still might make it, you know how he is. He'll be late for some funeral." Cassandra laughed. "You're probably right." They continued to talk, carry on, and have a good time as Sam led them up the trail. Chelsea stopped whining, and everyone seemed to be having fun. They continued to climb, reveling in the sights of beautiful mountain views. The fragrant flowers mixed with the smell of pine had a very soothing effect. The squirrels chattering and the birds chirping made them glad they had come on this trip. They reached a clearing and Sam came to a stop. "Hey guys, let's take a break." They all found a spot to sit and take a drink. Out of curiosity, Sam pulled a pair of binoculars out of his pack and started looking around. "Wow, you can see everything from here. I can even see the parking lot where Sherry tried to kill me." "Oh my god, I missed you by 6 inches, she retorted. "How you got your driver's license?" "I'll never know." Sherry stuck her tongue out at Sam. "That's odd," Sam said, ignoring her. "There's another car parked there." "Oh, maybe it's George," Chelsea said. No, it's not George's car," Sam replied. "Oh wow, someone else is walking the trail today," Tara said. Sam looked at the car more closely. There was nothing wrong with it. It just felt wrong, and he didn't know exactly why. Oh, he shrugged it off and sat down to take a break. JD, are you okay?" Cassandra asked. "I'm fine. Why?" You have blood dripping down your chin." JD's face turned red with embarrassment. "It is not blood. I carried tomato juice in my canteen," she said quickly, trying to clean herself up. "Oh, okay," Cassandra said, slowly backing away. Why don't we get going?" Tara said, trying to avoid watching JD. "Yeah, let's get there so we can relax," Sam said. He looked at the parking lot one more time. The sign at the base of the trail that had read, "Beware of wild animals," had a section broken off that was lying in the grass. He shrugged it off and continued up the trail, not knowing that the fallen section off of the sign said, "Bear mating season." said. I'll do it, Sherry said. I'll be back shortly. Cassandra just rolled her eyes. Hey, JD, Sherry yelled. Where are ya? We want to make sure you didn't fall into an anthill or something. I'm here, she said from the bushes. Sherry jumped. Where? Oh, don't worry about it. I'm not done yet. Well, I said I would check on you. I've checked on you. So I'm gonna go back, track a bit, and see if George made it yet. Oh, don't worry. I'll tell the others. Thanks, short stuff. Sherry walked for a few minutes, oblivious to the shadow watching her. She paused to look at the beautiful view when a hand appeared and pushed her over the edge. She plummeted 1,000 feet, screaming as she fell. Chapter 2. Hey everyone, stop, Chelsea said. Do you hear that? It sounds like some animal got its tail stepped on, Sam said. A few minutes later, JD caught up with the group. What took you so long? Dare asked. Sorry, indigestion, JD said sheepishly. Did you see Sherry? Cassandra asked. Yeah, she told me she was going to look for George and she would catch up to us at Lookout Point. That girl's a free spirit. You can't control her, Sam said. So much for taking a hike together, Cassandra said. We're dropping like flies. Did you hear that screaming, Chelsea? Asked JD. Yes, it sounded adorable, like a laughing hyena being put out of its misery, JD said. Chelsea eyed her warily. Late in the day, they finally arrived at Lookout Point. They all collapsed in a heap. After they took a short rest, they slowly started setting up camp. The tents were placed here and there, with JD's tent being the furthest one from the fire. JD's furthest one from the fire. Sam dragged some logs into the camp so they could sit around the fire while JD gathered some firewood. Chelsea and Cassandra worked on getting the fire going. Hey, do you notice anything different about JD? Chelsea asked. She does seem a little quieter than usual, Cassandra said. You know, she mentioned to me a few weeks ago about some new medication the doctor was putting her on, but she wouldn't say what it was for. Maybe we should talk to her instead of talking about her. Just then, JD walked up carrying an armful of sticks. Chelsea and Cassandra hesitated not to know how much JD had heard. Hey, JD, Cassandra said. How are you feeling? Fine, why? JD snapped defensively. No reason. Chelsea said, just curious. JD dropped the sticks, turned and walked away. Well, that could have gone better, Cassandra said. They got the fire going just as darkness was setting in. They all sat around it and ate their sandwiches. JD produced a small bag of marshmallows and said, it's not a real campfire unless you roast marshmallows. She handed out sticks and she had found that were perfect for the job. I've got a special stick for you, Dara, JD said. Thanks, JD, but why are you wearing gloves? I wasn't sure if I got all the thorns off the sticks. They roasted and ate the marshmallows. All but JD. She ate some jerky she had brought along. The conversation wandered from current affairs to politics to movies to music to Sherry and George. Scary stories were avoided. A few hours later, Sam stood and stretched. Well, I think I'll turn in for the night. Hey, don't forget to douse the fire when you're done. Good night. Yeah, I'm said. I'm not feeling very good. Good night. Chelsea, Cassandra, and JD were the only ones left at the fire. The silence was so tense that every time the fire cracked and crackled, Chelsea jumped. JD sat and stared at them. The fire lit her face in a way that seemed to fill it with menace. I wonder where Sherry is, Cassandra said to try and lighten the mood. I wonder if she found out what happened to George, Chelsea added. Oh, I wouldn't worry about Sherry, JD said. I'm sure she got to the bottom of it. JD smiled and went to her tent. Chelsea and Cassandra exchanged looks of question and concern, then shrugged it off. I'm going to bed too, said Chelsea, yawning. Good night. Cassandra sat by the fire looking at the stars. The warm summer breeze washed over her, carrying it with the pleasant scent of pine and oleander. The dark figure rose from the shadows. It slowly stalked up behind Cassandra like a predator ready to pounce. Ever closer it crept on all fours until the moment was right, and it lunged. Chapter 3. Sam was dozing when he heard the scream. When he jumped up, his first thought was to get what he had packed in his supplies. He found what he wanted and emerged from his tent carrying a flashlight in one hand and a handgun in the other. He led with the handgun, watching for any movement. When he cleared the edge of his tent, he nearly doubled over laughing. Cassandra was giving George quite a beating. He was laying on the ground, curled up in the fetal position as she pummeled him with her fists. Sam pulled her off him, still kicking at him. What happened? Sam asked. He scared the crap out of me, Cassandra screamed. That's what happened. George looked sheepish. Yeah, I snuck up on her, he said. So where have you been? Sam asked George, trying not to laugh. I had car trouble, George said. I started out late. Oh, big surprise there, Sam said. Hey, did you see Sherry? Cassandra asked, trying to regain her composure. No, why? Isn't she here? George said. Well, that's weird, because she went back to look for you, Sam said. I didn't see anybody on the trail, George said. Nobody? I heard what sounded like a scream, so I took out my binoculars and looked around. The only thing I saw was JT looking over the edge of the cliff. Cassandra's face became a mask of concern. I hope Sherry's alright, she said. Actually, we should go look for her, George said, then started down the trail. Oh, hold on, Sam said, grabbing George's arm. It's the middle of the night. You said you did not see her on the way up when it was light. What makes you think you'll find her in the dark? We have to do something, George said. You're right, Sam said. We have to get some sleep so we can start looking for her at first light. Just then another scream pierced the night air. They ran over to see Chelsea backing away from Tara's tent. What's wrong? Cassandra asked. She's dead. Chelsea said, Tara's dead. Sam darted inside quickly, followed by Cassandra. They checked for a pulse, but she had none. How? Sam asked, shocked. I don't know, Cassandra said. There's no blood capsule as though she were asleep and would wake at any moment. Looking at Tara's dead body was very disconcerting, so they went back outside. "Chelsea," Cassandra said, "did you see anything?" "No, I was coming over to see what all the commotion was about when I noticed that Tara was still in her tent," Chelsea said, starting to tear up. "I tried to wake her, but she wouldn't wake up. That's when I felt her pulse and came out screaming." What could have done this?" Sam said. She felt sick earlier, Cassandra said, "but it didn't seem too severe. I didn't see her eat or drink anything that would have killed her," Sam said. "The last thing she ate in it was a marshmallow," Cassandra said. "Yeah, but we all ate marshmallows," Sam said. "I don't feel dead, do you?" "That was a little out of line, don't you think?" George said. "What?" Sam shot back, making a joke out of this. "No one's making a joke. We're trying to figure this out," Cassandra interjected. "I have to interrupt, but where's JD?" Chelsea said. They all turned towards JD's tent. She hadn't come out either, even after both ear-splitting screams. Slowly, they all approached and pulled open the tent flap. A small black spider crawled out, prompting Chelsea into a comical dance of convulsions to get out of its way. Sam stepped on it and carefully looked at the red hourglass shape on its body. "A black widow," he said, "but I didn't think they lived around these areas." They carefully peered inside the tent, keeping an eye out for any more spiders. JD was lying very still. Cassandra checked her breathing and pulse. Both were non-existent. George could see the spider bite on her neck. Sam looked warily at George and Chelsea. Chelsea just looked scared. Cassandra covered JD's face with her sleeping bag, shook her head, and they all came back out of the tent. "What's going on here?" George asked. "We could ask you the same question," Sam said. "What are you talking about?" George asked. "Sherry goes missing, and you say you haven't seen her. Now Tara and JD wind up dead," Sam asked. "Is that an accusation?" George asked. "Take it as you will," said Sam. "How about some proof, cowboy?" "Cassandra," Sam said, ignoring George. "How long were you sitting out here alone?" I don't know, maybe half an hour." "And how long before that did the others go to their tents?" Sam asked. "Well, Tara went at the same time you did," Cassandra said. "Then JD and Chelsea went about 15 minutes after that." "Wait a minute," George interjected. "If we're throwing around accusations, then what about you?" person looked wearily at each other. Right now, there's only one thing we need to do, Sam said. Bury our friends. You're joking, right? George said. We're not even positive they're dead. Do you want to wait until they start rotting, Sam said, until the buzzards start to circle, until the coyotes start gnawing on their bones? They all looked silent. I didn't think so, Sam said, looking. I don't like it any more than any of you, but it is what it is. And now we have to deal with it. He went to his tent and came back with the camp shovel. George looked at it suspiciously. You just happen to have a shovel with you, George said. Yes, I carry it every time I camp. That's why they call it a camp shovel, genius. How many other people have you buried with it? Sam glared at him. None, but I can bury you if you would like, Sam said, gripping the shovel tightly. Stop it, Cassandra said. Both of you. No one wants to do this, so let's just get it over with, Chelsea said. 3 hours later, 2 mounds of earth were all that marked the shallow graves. The 4 survivors were exhausted from taking turns digging as the sun rose behind them. It cast their shadows over the graves. Should we say something? Chelsea asked. They each looked uncomfortably at the other. No one seemed to know what to say. God, please watch over our friends, Chelsea said. They broke camp, carrying as much of J.D. and Dara's personal effects as they could. The happy, jovial group that had set up camp less than 12 hours ago was now silent and morose. Each was trapped in their own thoughts. They started to back down the trail when George stopped them. Hold on, he said. Are we just gonna stroll like nothing's happened? What do you want us to do? Chelsea asked. 2 of her friends are dead. One of us is the main suspect, George said. Which one, George? Enlighten us, Sam said through gritted teeth. Well, you're my number 1 suspect, and you're the only one carrying a gun. And that's why. That's the way it is gonna stay. Let me ask you something, George. Did J.D. or Dara die from a gunshot wound? George faltered. No. Exactly, Sam said. Then he got right in George's face. If I was a killer, you'd all be dead. He then turned around and started down the trail. Chelsea and Cassandra followed him, and George reluctantly fell in line. None of them saw the hand rise out of the mound of fresh dug earth on the dirt. The dirty, smiling face that watched them go. Chapter 4. You heard it that time, right? Sam asked Chelsea. No, I didn't hear anything, she replied. Frustrated, Sam said, I know I am not going crazy. I know I heard someone say, help, help, help. I didn't hear it either, George said. Cassandra, Sam asked, looking desperate. I'm sorry, Sam, I just hear the sounds of the forest. I'm not losing my mind, Sam bellowed. I heard someone say help. And I'm going to help them. Who's coming with me? The other 3 looked from one to another, but no one said anything. Really? Sam said. It's not that we don't believe you, Cassandra said. It's just, well, you were saying you heard a call from the middle of the forest off the trail. We don't want to get lost. Fine. I'll go myself. Wait, are you crazy? Chelsea said. You could get lost too. There was no mistaking the look of determination in Sam's eyes. Wait for me in the parking lot, he said to them, and then disappeared into the woods. What do we do now? Chelsea asked. He's a big boy. He can handle himself, George said. Besides, he's less of a threat to us now. What's that supposed to mean? Chelsea said. I mean, I think he killed Tara. Maybe JD. Maybe JD too, George said. Are you crazy? Cassandra said. Sam didn't kill anyone. How do you know? George said. Because I just know, Cassandra said. You know because you did it, George said. Cassandra rolled her eyes. You're an idiot. This is pointless. We need to decide what we're doing, Chelsea said. Are we going to follow Sam or keep going on the trail? The argument raged back and forth for a while, until they heard the gunshot. Sam started through the woods, away from the trail, listening intently for the call for help. The further he went, the denser the forest became. Now it was so thick that only a few rays of the late morning sunlight were making it into the ground. The air smelled stuffy, and the trees seemed close to close around him. No sounds of animals scurrying about, no birds chirping. Even the wind had abandoned him. The silence was complete and suffocating. He had never felt so alone. Sherry, Sam yelled, shattering the stillness. No one responded, not even the shadow that stole behind him a handful of yards away. Sam had kept his gun in his waistband, thinking he wouldn't need it to find someone, but an eerie feeling began to creep up the back of his neck. He pulled out the handgun warily in front of him. His steps became slower, more cautious. His footfalls seemed to echo, making him feel even more ill at ease. This isn't right. The forest should not be this quiet. When he stopped unexpectedly, he heard another footstep behind him. His blood froze. He reacted nonetheless. He turned just in time to see the tree limb smash into the side of his face. The impact threw him to the ground, railing in pain, and jarred the pistol from his hand. He recovered and scrambled to retrieve the weapon, only to receive a devastating blow to the back of his head. He collapsed to the ground. His vision began to swim and his thoughts became hazy. His last memories were a loud sound, incredible pain, the smell of gunpowder, then darkness. Chapter 5. They crept through the woods, trying to be as quiet as possible. It didn't matter. The shadow knew they were coming. The sights of Sam's gun lined up with George's head sitting right in the middle. The shadow slowly squeezed the trigger further back, then suddenly released the pressure. Too predictable, too boring. It needs to be more inventive. Single file, they crept as quiet as possible. Cassandra was in the lead, then Chelsea, with George trailing along grudgingly. I can't believe they talked me into this. For all we know, Sam fired a shot in the air to lure us off the path so he could dispose of the bodies more easily. Cassandra was having a hard time believing she had ignored her own advice and led the others into the woods, away from the trail, especially after a little speech to Sam about getting lost. Who in the right mind goes looking for the source of a gunshot, unless they also have a gun, which we don't? Chelsea was looking around cautiously at the trees, which seemed to hold some secret menace. She was wound up tighter than a rubber band. She wasn't watching where she was going and bumped into Cassandra. They both screamed and jumped like marionettes caught in a ceiling fan. not this again." The words were barely out of her mouth when she heard it too. Someone or something was rustling through the woods coming towards them. "Sam," Cassandra cautiously said. "Sherry," Chelsea added. No answer. The rustling got closer and closer, then suddenly stopped. They waited with breathless anticipation. The forest seemed to close in around them as they all stared at the same spot. George quit breathing. "So heavy," Chelsea whispered. "It's not me," he whispered back. "It's whoever is out there," Cassandra whispered. The trees moved to the edge of a small clearing, and out stepped a 600-pound bear. Chelsea started to scream, but George and Cassandra clamped their hands over her mouth. "Don't startle it, or it'll kill us all," George whispered in her ear. She watched with eyes the size of saucers as it slowly lumbered up and stared at them and started sniffing at her. It started with her shoes and worked its way up her legs, stopping and sniffing intently around her waistline. "Hey, that's Private Buddy," she said, then smacked the bear in the nose. George and Cassandra froze in terror. Chelsea just stood with arms folded, indignant. The bear shook its head and sat back on his haunches, staring at her, then got up and slowly lumbered away. George and Cassandra were in shock with disbelief. They were just about to congratulate Chelsea when a shot rang out. They all looked at each other to see who had been hit. When the bear roared in anger, it turned back towards them and charged. Chapter 6. Chelsea, Cassandra, and George each ran in different directions. The shadow dropped from its hiding place and followed the bear to witness the kill. Cassandra ran as hard as she could. After a few minutes, she dared to glance back and saw the bear wasn't chasing her. She slowed down and eventually stopped, catching her breath. When she had rested, she looked around, but everything was unfamiliar. She was lost in the forest. George ran, tripped, stumbled, and fell his way through the woods. Scratched through and bruised, he finally collapsed on the ground. He looked around and did not see the bear, but did see that he had stumbled back onto the trail. He got up and started walking toward the parking lot. "Good luck, ladies," he said towards the forest. "I'm out of here." He started down the trail, ignoring the gentle tug of his conscience. Chelsea was not considered a fast runner, but right now, with the bear running behind her, she could break some world records. She whipped her head around, only to see the bear slowly gaining on her. She started to panic when suddenly something in front of her shocked her so badly that she skidded to a stop. A shadow was standing there waiting for her. It stepped into the light. "JD," she said, not believing her own eyes. "Yeah, it's me," JD responded. "How? Why?" Chelsea asked. When JD shoved her out of the path of the charging bear, it slid to a stop and then charged after both of them. They both started running. "You were dead," Chelsea said. While they ran, "We buried you." "Only half right," JD answered. "I faked my death." "Why?" "To watch you buffoons stumble around in the dark, not knowing who was hurting you or hunting you." Chelsea looked confused. "Then why save me from the bear just now?" "That's easy," she said, grinning to gloat. Chelsea tripped, running full speed, sending her tumbling literally head over heels. It didn't take long for the bear to pounce on her. JD didn't even look back, it just kept running. 2 more, she thought, with a wicked, wicked, wicked grin. Chapter 7. 24 hours earlier, Cassandra pulled her car into the parking lot. The beautiful mountains towered in front of her. She wasn't sure who would show up. She thought this would be a nice way to end the summer with her friends before everyone went their own way. Looking around, she saw that JD was already there, writing in her notebook. Cassandra smiled. Little JD, mascot for the group, always writing in her notebook. Cassandra knew how smart JD was and expected to see her name on a best-selling novel someday. She just wished everyone else could see past her physical limitations and see JD for who she really was. Cassandra's train of thought was broken when Sam and Sherry pulled in. Sam parked his car and Sherry parked her motorcycle. Then she spotted JD. She put down her helmet and snuck up behind JD's car. She reached through the open window and snatched the notebook out of her hands. "What you writing, JD?" "A short story." Sherry cheered. JD jumped out of the car and lunged for her notebook. Sherry playfully held it above her head, putting it well out of JD's reach. Sherry laughed at JD, desperately jumping to reach her notebook. She looked up and read the page JD had just been writing on. "Hey, what's this?" Sherry said, "A list of everyone who's coming on this trip. I wanted to make sure we had everyone before we left." "Aw," Sherry said, patting JD on the head. "That is so cute. Don't forget to check off my name." JD grabbed the notebook and murmured, "Oh, I won't forget." Cassandra woke with a start to the sound of echoing thunder and torrential rain. She had been dreaming, but couldn't remember what the dream was about. She whispered a silent prayer of thanks that she thought her backpack with her tent attached. She had tried to find her way back to the trail, but darkness had set in. So she set up her tent and went into an uneasy sleep. Once the storm had awakened her, sleep eluded her for the rest of the night. All that kept running through her mind was, what is happening here? First, Sherry disappears, then Tara and JD die for some mysterious reason. Then Sam disappears. Now, I'm not even sure where George and Chelsea are. It's like a bad horror movie. Cassandra didn't want to go anywhere in the downpour, so she waited all through the night and into the next day. It poured rain. Cassandra began to wonder if she shouldn't kept an eye out for a big boat with lots of animals on it. When the rain finally ended, Cassandra emerged, having made a decision. "I'm lost. There's no debating that, so I'll go downhill as much as possible and hope to find the trail, or better yet, the parking lot." She entertained the thoughts of looking for George and Chelsea, but knew that with the size of this forest, they could be anywhere. The only option that made sense is to find her way back to her car, then bring back help. She emerged from her tent into a whole new world. During the storm, trees had fallen, blocking her path in some places. Where dry trenches had been before, now there were fast-moving miniature rivers. Even her footing was more precarious due to wet, slippery leaves. Oh, this is going to be tougher than before. Her thoughts were proven right almost immediately. As she turned to pack up her tent, she slipped, fell, and began to slide. She fought to stop her momentum, to no avail, sliding out of control, trying her best to avoid slamming into trees. Eventually, she managed to stop herself. When she looked back up the hill, barely see her gear. It was around 200 yards away. 200 yards of climbing uphill on a wet banana peel. I don't think that's happening. Hating to leave her gear behind, realizing she didn't have much choice, she started downhill again. She followed the river, staying far enough away from the bank to avoid falling in and being swept away. She had not gone far until she stopped and listened. Someone was calling over the noise of the river. "Hello," called a familiar voice. Cassandra followed it and was shocked to find J.D. "Cassandra, thank God," J.C. said, hugging her. "J.D., you're alive." "No thanks to you," she said with a playful grin. But you were dead. I guess that spider only gave me enough venom to take a short nap. Where have you been?" "Trying to find the rest of you." "Have you seen anybody else?" "Only Chelsea," she said with a far-off look. "Really? When?" When she tried to kill me." "What?" "Oh, didn't you know?" J.C. said. "Chelsea's the killer." "She can't be. I saw her slip into the terrace tent that night when you stayed by the campfire. It's not possible." "Shells or Sam's gun to backfire," J.D. said. "I found him dead from a chest wound." Cassandra's mind was going 1,000 miles an hour. How could my best friend be a murderer? J.D. watched her with mild amusement. "Wait a minute," Cassandra said. "There was a second shot. The one that scared the bear." "Bravo," J.D. said, clapping her hands slowly. Cassandra stared at her, not wanting to believe it. "It was you, wasn't it?" "Indeed," J.D. said, pulling out Sam's gun and pointing it directly at her. "So tell me, Dr. Watson, how did you deduce this?" Cassandra flinched from the sight of the gun, but tried to form a plan. "You killed Sherry by pushing her off the cliff. George said he saw you looking over the edge." "Very good. However, technically gravity killed her." Cassandra ignored the comment and continued. "Then you poisoned Tara somehow. Then faked your own death." J.D. giggled. "I'm quite proud of that one, you see. Oleander sticks are quite poisonous. Not the best choice to roast a marshmallow with." "I assume you shot Sam since you're holding his gun." "Correct." "So what about George and Chelsea?" "Oh, George I'll deal with soon enough. As for Chelsea, let's just say I helped her, well, get a little closer to nature." "But why?" At last we come to the most obvious of questions. Why? The answer is simple. Altitude deficiency. Cassandra stared blankly. "Because you're short." "No, because all of you made fun of me for being short," J.D. screamed with sudden fury. Cassandra looked into the eyes of the savage creature that resembled her friend. "You killed your friends because you couldn't take a joke. Why didn't you just say, 'Hey, I don't appreciate the short jokes, knock it off'? You have no idea what it's like to be tormented every day, to be treated like a child, like a non-entity." But Cassandra didn't seem to hear her. She had frozen in horror. Her gaze was locked on something just behind J.D. J.D. turned, thinking the bear might have been coming back. She realized her mistake when she felt the hand shoving her into the swift-moving river. Chapter 8. J.D. was swept away. In an instant, the river slammed her into rocks, dragged her along the bottom, and tumbled her head over heels. She desperately tried to hold on to the gun, but smashing into a rock isolation and continued to make her way down the hill. Just then a passing thought hit her like a wrecking ball. She'll survive. I haven't ended anything, only prolonged it. Desperately, she began searching the ground for fallen branches, testing them for durability in a weight that she could handle. Finally, she found the perfect one. Cassandra felt better feeling the weight of the club resting on her shoulder. She set off again, more confident. She was ready for JD. JD had watched Cassandra when she started from the tent. She watched her comical slide down the hill and had stalked her for a while before confronting her. JD knew Cassandra would continue to follow the river. She also knew that without a weapon, JD would be at a disadvantage in a fight. She decided to tip the scales in her favor. JD quickly contrived whatever trap she could to get the upper hand in her next confrontation. She made piles of loose rocks with leaves to hide them. A small hole she had covered with sticks. Then found a large tree limb leaning just right, ready to be pushed over and crush an unsuspecting victim. Cassandra continued to follow the river, hoping it would lead her out of this horror. Her mind reeled at the events of the last 2 days. Is that all it's been? It feels like a month since we started up the trail for a nice camp out with friends. Who would have thought it would end or turn out like this? She walked absently, buried in her thoughts. Suddenly a feeling came over her. Get away from the river. She stopped and looked at the river. Everything appeared fine. There was no danger she could see, but she couldn't shake that feeling. Get away from the river. She gave in and quietly made her way from the river, but still continued downhill. She walked a half mile, keeping at least 50 feet between her and the river, but still following it. She stopped for a break and looked back at the hill to see how far she had come. It was then that she noticed something. Someone was standing beside a tree near the river. She crept a little closer and saw that it was JD. Her first instinct was to run before JD saw her. But then she realized that JD wasn't even looking at her. She was staring uphill near the river, right where Cassandra would have walked through. A chill immediately ran through her. She set a trap for me. At first, the thought frightened her, but then another feeling came over her, steely resolve. She stared towards JD slowly, as silently as she could. Every sound seemed magnified with each step. Cassandra moved more and more, convinced JD was playing possum and would turn around at any moment and say, "Gotcha!" Chapter 9. It's been too long. She must have taken a break or something. JD continued to scan the hillside. She should have already been here, unless... Her other voice said, "Unless what? Unless you just missed her." "Not possible. I know Cassandra, and she'll follow the river." "Are you sure?" asked the doubting voice. "Yes, she probably had a little breakdown from fear and had to convince herself to keep going." "Or," said the doubter. "Or what?" "Or she went around you, spotted you, and is sneaking up on you right now." JD scoffed. "I fell for that once. I'm not stupid enough to do it again." "You really should turn around." "I'm not going to do it." "Turn around." "No. Now." "Fine." She turned, just Unconscious before she hit the ground, Cassandra stood over her, breathing hard, adrenaline pumping. She thought about the death that JT had dealt out, about the loss of her many friends. Rage flowed through her as she raised the club to take a killing blow. It hovered over her head. "Go on, do it. She deserves it for what she's done," whispered the voice in her head. "She wouldn't hesitate to kill you." "Maybe she does deserve it, but I can't do it. I'm not a killer like her." She dropped the club beside JT's unconscious body and started following the river again. Soon the river slowed and fed into the lake. Cassandra stood on the shore looking across and nearly cried. On the far side was the trail. She waded into the water and swam across, nearly exhausted when she got to the other side. She trudged through the marshy shallows, working toward the sandy bank. She climbed out of the water and stood in the sand, looking at the trail. Merely a few yards away, tears welled in her eyes. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Everything instantly seemed better. The air smelled sweeter. The clouds were puffier. The trees grew faster. Wait a minute. The trees aren't growing faster. Either that or I'm shrinking. She looked down and her feet were gone. She panicked, struggling to free herself, but that only made her sink deeper into the quicksand. She quickly looked around and spotted a low-hanging tree limb. She strained as hard as she could and finally wrapped one hand around it, pulling up. She got a second hand on and freed herself. She swung over to the tree and carefully walked around the patches of the sand, making her way to the trail. JT approached the lake and swam across just as Cassandra had done, only slower. Her left eye was swelled shut from the tree limbs smashing into it. She was sore all over, but still determined to get revenge. She climbed up the same bank Cassandra had and sank into this quicksand. The same quicksand. She struggled to free herself, reaching for the same tree limb, but it was just out of her reach. As she slowly sank, she thought, "Wow, this is truly the ultimate short joke." She started laughing, that turned into screaming. "No, no, no, no." Her scream echoed off the mountains. Cassandra paused and she heard the scream, then shook her head sadly, got into her car and drove away. JT struggled harder, making her sink even faster. Slowly, steadily, sank up to her neck. Now, so this is how it ends. Not with a bang, but with a gurgle. The quicksand consumed her as she breathed one last breath and sunk into darkness. Chapter 10. JT opened her eye and stared up at the metal bunk as she looked around the room. Aside from being surprised to be alive, she was surprised to be in jail. Cassandra must have gone straight to the police. She slowly got up, still sore, and tried to stretch. Convulsions of pain racked her body. She sat back down and decided not to stretch. An officer dressed in a brown uniform walked up to the bars. "Well, how you feeling?" she asked. The officer asked. "Alive," JT answered. "Do I have you to thank for that?" "Yep," she answered. "That plus your screaming. I wouldn't have seen you at all if you hadn't screamed." "Well," JT said, "thank you for saving my life." JT stuck her hand out through the bars. The officer looked at it and shook her hand. "I'm sorry," the officer said. "Where's my manners?" She went to the door, unlocked it, and swung it open. JT just looked at her. "So I can come out?" "Well, sure, why not?" she said. "You didn't do anything wrong. You were just officer laughed, and JD laughed right along with her. "No, why would I think that?" JD said. "I'm Jane," she said. JD, your face is pretty swollen. I doubt that quicksand did that. JD thought how she got the injury and who she was talking to. "Oh, I fell in the river and got pretty banged up. I put some salve on it. That should help, but you should see a doctor when you get home." Yeah, I'll do that," JD said, looking at the handgun Jane was wearing. "Where's your car? I'll drive you to it." "It's in the parking lot for Lookout Point." When Jane drove her back, the sun had just come up. "How long was I out?" JD asked. "About 14 hours. "Hey, thanks again for saving my life," JD said as they pulled into the lot. "No problem," Jane said with a big smile. "Are you going to be okay to drive?" JD smiled back. "I'll be just fine, thanks." Jane drove off with a wave. JD walked to her car with no intention of going home and every intention of driving straight to Cassandra's house. As she neared the car, it looked like someone had dumped 4 piles of bloody rags near it. Then one of the piles moved. It stood and came towards her. "Sherry," JD said, backing away. She backed into another pile of rags. "Sam." The other 2 piles grabbed her arms. "Tara, Chelsea." They all glared at her. "Is this a dream?" she asked. "More like a nightmare for you," Sam said. "But how?" Sam pulled up his shirt to show his wound. "You missed my heart," he said with barely restrained fury. "I guess you didn't give me quite enough poison," Tara said. "I woke up with a headache and an extreme case of claustrophobia." JD looked at Sherry. "Updraft, tree limbs, river," Sherry said. JD turned to Chelsea. "I know you didn't outrun that bear. Some things are better left unsaid," Chelsea whimpered. "Now," Sam said, "what should we do to you?" JD swallowed hard. Chapter 11. Sam sat at the table of a nice cafe. He sipped coffee and watched with an appraising eye as patrons came and went. He saw her walking up the sidewalk towards him, and immediately long, buried thoughts began to resurface. Cassandra approached the table and helped herself to a seat. He nodded in acknowledgement and motioned a waiter over. She ordered a tea and waited for it to be served before attempting a conversation. "So have you been?" she started, knowing that it was a stupid question. "Fine," came the well-rehearsed but untruthful answer. "I haven't seen you around lately." "Been busy." "Have you heard from anyone?" "No." "Me either," she said, trying to find a different way of asking the unaskable. They sat in uncomfortable silence, watching people come and go. "Why did you invite me here?" he asked. "I just haven't talked to anyone from that group for months. I was curious how everybody was doing." He leaned back in his chair and stared at her. "That's not what you really wanted to know, is it?" She flushed ever so slightly. "I haven't heard from JD since the forest incident." "Me neither," he said, looking away. "Imagine that." Finally, she got up enough nerve to ask the question that had burned in her for months. "What happened that day?" Sam rose from his seat, dropped some money to cover his bill, and turned to leave. "Sam." He stopped and slowly turned around. "What did you do to her?" The corner of his lip raised ever so slightly. "Oh, what she deserved," he said, then walked away. Thank you for listening to the short story called The Trail. As I underscore writer underscore 1717